They made her hold the door open while the others walked past, smirking, laughing, thanking everyone but her, as if the black girl in the tailored blazer was part of the furniture, not the intern who built the strategy they were about to present. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just the sharp sting of being reduced to silence, while her ideas were paraded under someone else's name. She wasn't just overlooked, she was strategically erased, her presence treated like a mistake that no one had the courage to correct. And yet, behind that quiet stare and clipped steps, she carried something they hadn't bothered to see, something that would bring the whole performance crashing down. This isn't just another office drama. It's the moment the underdog stops shrinking. If that opening hit you hard, like and subscribe for the full unraveling. Comment below, where are you watching from? And how far do you think they'll go before everything breaks? Tiana Ellison arrived at Graymore Stratton Group with a kind of quiet confidence that didn't need a spotlight to burn. Fresh out of graduate school with honors and accolades to her name, she had worked tirelessly to earn her spot in one of the most competitive corporate internship programs on the East Coast. The building itself stood like a fortress of polished glass and silent expectation, its revolving doors swallowing her into a world that had already decided what she was before she even introduced herself. She was one of 4 interns that season, the only one who wasn't white, and the only one who didn't have an Ivy League surname to glide her through introductions. Tiana noticed the difference immediately, not in what was said, but in the subtleties, the slight delays in eye contact, the double takes at her name badge, the unnecessary confirmations of her credentials, as if someone had let her slip through a crack in the admissions process. Margot Langford was the Senior Director of Strategic Operations and the direct overseer of the intern program. Her reputation preceded her, elegant, efficient, and ruthless. Margot carried herself with a grace honed by years of calculated wins, her platinum hair always pulled back in a tight, gleaming knot. She met the interns in a glass conference room that smelled of leather and lemon polish. As she read their names and school affiliations from a printed itinerary, her voice never faltered, until she reached Tiana's. A pause, barely a second, then a brief upturn of the lips that didn't reach her eyes before moving on. Tiana sat straighter in her seat. Assignments were distributed at the end of that meeting. The 3 other interns were placed in various project pods across marketing, investment strategy, and client solutions. Tiana was handed a clipboard with a filing schedule and told she would begin her rotation in records and operation support. The phrasing sounded formal, but the reality hit hard when she found herself deep in the concrete basement level of the building, surrounded by rusted filing cabinets and gray steel shelves. No Wi-Fi, no windows, just the hum of a decades-old ventilation system and the weight of papers forgotten by time. She was given gloves. No explanation. That first week passed with quiet resolve. Tiana didn't ask questions. She didn't push back. She told herself that this was a rite of passage, that perhaps each intern was being tested in a different way. But when she ran into Daniel, one of the other interns, by the lobby coffee bar, her assumptions cracked. He mentioned their strategy roundtable, how engaging it was to sit in on planning meetings, how Margot had even taken the time to mentor him on executive language. Tiana nodded with a tight smile, even as her stomach twisted. She hadn't been invited to a single roundtable. She hadn't been given a single contact beyond the front desk associate who signed her in each day. Later that week, a firm-wide innovation showcase was being held in the atrium, a glossy space built like a corporate theater, all glass-paneled balconies and modular chairs. The interns were expected to attend, network, and observe. Margot approached Tiana in the elevator vestibule before the event. With a smooth tone of someone doing you a favor, she asked her to stay back and hand out printed schedules to arriving executives, explaining that logistics support was just as vital as ideation. Tiana hesitated, then nodded, tucking the stack under her arm as she stood alone at the building's entrance. For 40 minutes, she stood beneath the shadow of the firm's crest, handing out printed papers as her peers laughed and mingled under chandeliers. She could see them through the glass. They didn't look out. She returned to her archive duties the following day, her footsteps echoing in the basement hall. There was no sign of progress, no hint of transition. When she asked Margot during a quiet moment if she might join a client review session to observe, the answer was crisp and immediate. The room is already full. She passed by the door 10 minutes later for open seats. Not one person looked at her as she walked past. The days blurred. Tiana was asked to deliver documents to a conference room during a budget strategy session. As she entered, Margot looked up from her seat and gestured without emotion toward the coffee station. "Could you prep the coffee tray?" That was it. No greeting. No introduction to the room. Tiana carried steaming mugs to men and women who didn't ask who she was. One thanked her without looking up. Another took his cup with a curt nod and began speaking again before she walked away. It was the small, precise cuts that did the real damage. Margot would compliment the others in public, post about their progress on the firm's internal board. Tiana's name was never mentioned. She completed reports that were submitted under someone else's name. She handed in analysis that was quietly shelved. Her ID badge began to malfunction, randomly at first, then persistently. She had to be buzzed in each morning while others walked through. She inquired at reception. They said IT would look into it. It never changed. A month into her rotation, the interns were asked to attend a feedback circle. It was informal, casual, snacks, notepads, low lighting. Margot stood at the head of the table. She praised Julian's creative pitch, applauded Maria's report formatting, and laughed at Daniel's clever insights. Then she turned to Tiana. "You're still with records, yes?" she asked. There was a softness to her tone, the kind of softness that hides knives. That's a critical foundation to build from. Very grounding. There were smiles around the room, not warm ones. Polite, surface deep. Tiana didn't speak. Without looking up, she handed it to Tiana and instructed her to assist with the internal branding campaign scheduled to launch that Friday. The assignment, Margot explained, would give interns the opportunity to represent Graymore's future-facing image. What she didn't mention was that Tiana's participation had already been decided down to the fabric of her role. The campaign team buzzed with rehearsed energy as she arrived at the photo staging area. The white interns were already suited up, hair touched up by a stylist Margot had brought in, posing confidently against custom backdrops labeled Visionary, Innovator, Executive. Tiana was handed a wrinkled beige button-up and a pair of flat shoes with peeling soles. A junior coordinator gestured toward a small corner of the frame set up to mimic an office supply room. Her sign read Miscellaneous. No one explained it. No one needed to. Tiana hesitated, then stepped behind the prop file cabinet and posed as instructed, holding a clipboard, looking attentive, but not too assertive. The photographer didn't say much. Margot passed by during the shoot and commented offhandedly that the visuals needed grounding, something practical. Tiana heard it clearly. After the session, she folded the shirt and left it on a chair, wondering if anyone else had noticed that hers had a faint stain near the hem. The next day, during an internal seminar titled Empowerment in Business, employees were encouraged to participate in live Q&A segments with senior leaders. Tiana had spent the night before crafting a thoughtful question about upward mobility in multi-generational firms. When the mic was passed to her, she stood and began to speak. Margot, sitting in the front row beside a division vice president, interrupted halfway through to correct the phrasing of her sentence. She asked Tiana to repeat the question using clearer diction. The room quieted. Tiana complied, slower this time, as if she were a child reading aloud in class. The answer that followed was vague and dismissive, focused more on corporate culture than the substance of Tiana's inquiry. When she returned to her seat, the man beside her gave a sympathetic half-smile, but said nothing. After the session, Margot made a point of praising Daniel's insightful comment and Maria's poise under pressure. She said nothing to Tiana. As the week wore on, Tiana was asked to assist in preparing packets for an upcoming partner onboarding session. She stayed past dark 3 nights that week, her fingers aching from folding brochures and binding welcome guides that bore the names of executives she'd never meet. When she submitted her completed inventory log, Margot took it without acknowledgement. The next morning, Tiana found the entire stack of folders moved to the opposite end of the office, marked with a sticky note in Margot's script. Needs proofreading. Nothing else. She corrected 2 typos that had not been hers and resubmitted them. No response came. Later that afternoon, the intern group was asked to present short summaries on department initiatives. Everyone else was told in advance. Tiana found out when Margot handed her a blank note card in front of the group and said it was time to learn how to improvise. She stood before a dozen employees, heart thudding, and managed to recall 3 bullet points from a report she hadn't been included on. She was cut off mid-sentence by Margot, who reminded the group that clarity was crucial in communication and suggested that interns prepare more thoroughly. Tiana sat down without a word. The silence that followed her was heavier than anything that had been said. That evening, she walked into the break room and overheard Julian joking with another associate about the campaign photos. He laughed about how one intern looked like they were restocking paper. When he saw Tiana, he froze, but neither apologized nor walked away. Tiana refilled her tea and left the room. On Friday, as the firm wrapped for the weekend, Tiana received an email from Margot's assistant. The subject line read, "Dress code reminder." The message specified that interns were expected to adhere to the updated dress guidelines. Only one intern had been copied. Only one name had been addressed directly. Tiana closed her inbox slowly. She reached into her bag, pulled out the tag from her dry cleaning receipt, the one for the pressed blouse she'd worn that very morning, and folded it into her wallet. No reply was sent. The following Monday, Margot distributed thank you cards to the executive board. Each intern was asked to sign them. Tiana was given a stack of blank cards and told to write out personalized notes in pen. "Handwritten notes show effort," Margot said, as she breezed past. After spending 2 hours on the task, Tiana noticed that her cards had been replaced in the outgoing tray by printed copies with a standard message and someone else's signature. Her stack had been discarded. She retrieved one from the bin. The paper was damp, bent, stained by the weight of something careless. It curled in her hand like it was trying to disappear. By now, the rehearsals of shame had become rhythm. Tiana moved through each day like a dancer mimicking the beat of a song she didn't choose. The smiles others gave her were thin, the acknowledgments fleeting, and the expectations always shifting just beyond her reach. She had started to believe this was what corporate assimilation required. Silence, compliance, invisibility. She no longer asked for feedback. She no longer volunteered questions. She stopped staying late, not out of defiance, but because there was no longer a reason to linger in a space that had already decided she was temporary. At night, she lay in bed wondering how long she could endure the quiet cruelties before something inside her gave way. The event was exclusive to interns who had demonstrated initiative and insight, according to the email sent to Julian, Maria, and Daniel. Tiana hadn't received the invitation, but she learned about it when Maria mentioned it over coffee. When she asked Margot about attending, the answer came swiftly and without eye contact. All slots were filled weeks ago. Perhaps next time. That Friday, as Tiana was organizing old binders in a dusty storage closet, she heard laughter and clinking glasses from the floor above. She climbed the stairs just far enough to glimpse the group through a half-open conference door. Interns, executives, a catered lunch, and Margot at the center of it all. Tiana stepped back down into the shadows and resumed her task, brushing cobwebs from a stack of forgotten financial reports that no one would ever read. Later that week, she received a message to deliver binders to a room scheduled for a client introduction session. It was a high-profile event that Tiana had researched extensively for a presentation she was never asked to give. When she arrived, the receptionist asked her to wait. Margot had apparently instructed that she not enter until she was summoned. So Tiana waited. 20 minutes passed, then 40. She stood by the elevator in her pressed gray blouse and heeled boots, holding 10 pounds of documentation as executives brushed past her without a glance. When the door finally opened, a junior associate walked out and asked what she was doing there. The binders were no longer needed. The client had already left. Tiana turned away, walked the entire length of the hall back to her desk, and placed the binders gently on the corner. Not a word was said to her the rest of the day. That pattern repeated itself like a quiet punishment. When interns were invited to shadow directors for a week-long immersion project, Tiana was assigned instead to document supply inventory for a quarterly compliance audit. She spent those 5 days in a locked backroom near shipping, counting toner cartridges, logging staples, and estimating paper consumption by department. There were no emails, no follow-ups, no invitations to reflect, just silence. Even the simple motion of printing her own name on a task sheet began to feel absurd. On Thursday, she asked HR to confirm whether her access permissions were correct because her employee profile no longer displayed upcoming training modules. They said they would escalate the request. She never heard back. On Monday morning, her ID badge failed again. This time, it didn't just deny access to the elevator. It triggered a security call at the front desk. She was asked to wait by the lobby wall while her file was reviewed. A man in a blazer arrived 15 minutes later, checked her name against a printed spreadsheet, and gave her a visitor sticker in place of her badge. Tiana took it in silence and walked to her floor with a paper tag taped to her chest like a guest in her own role. By now, the exhaustion wasn't just emotional. It had seeped into her physical movements. She moved more slowly, not from laziness, but from having had every instinct punished or ignored. Even the effort to sit upright during meetings had begun to feel performative. She had become a ghost in an open office, seen but not spoken to. The next humiliation came on a rainy afternoon when Margot arranged for the interns to attend a cross-functional team brainstorming session. The room had enough chairs for everyone but Tiana. When she walked in, Margot glanced up and motioned to the corner. Just grab a notepad and observe from the side. The side was a standing-only space next to the recycling bin. Tiana stood for the entire 90-minute session, scribbling notes while the others brainstormed around the whiteboard. When she offered a quiet suggestion during a lull in conversation, Margot blinked as if hearing a distant echo. Then she continued the discussion without acknowledging Tiana had spoken. Afterward, the whiteboard was photographed and sent out in an email titled Collaborative Intern Session Highlights. Tiana's name was not included in the list of contributors. The others were praised for their bold thinking. She deleted the email without reading further. The following day, the company hosted a visiting delegation from a partner firm overseas. All interns were instructed to assist with hospitality coordination, but only Tiana was told to remain by the elevators and escort guests to their floors. The rest were assigned to hosts and allowed to participate in guided tours and sessions. For 4 hours, Tiana greeted visitors in the lobby like a concierge, offering bottled water and laminated maps. At one point, a guest asked if she worked for facilities. She said yes. Each step forward became a loop, a return to invisibility, and still, she came in on time, dressed in quiet professionalism, carrying herself with a kind of dignity that could not be fully erased, no matter how much Margot Langford tried. But this week, the humiliation took on a new edge. There was an upcoming client pitch, one that would determine whether Graymore landed an international contract they had been chasing for months. The pitch preparation had consumed the office's attention, and while Margot had given Daniel the role of researcher and Maria the presentation visuals, Tiana had been assigned data compilation, a task meant to seem insignificant but crucial in laying the foundation of the entire proposal. Tiana worked through the spreadsheets meticulously, correcting decades of inconsistencies, cross-referencing legal standards, and building a cohesive financial argument for the firm's approach. She turned the work in with zero fanfare, emailing it directly to Margot, who replied with a single period, no acknowledgement, no edit, no thanks. On the morning of the presentation, Margot called a prep meeting for the intern team. They were each given printed copies of the final pitch deck. Tiana opened hers and felt the heat rise to her face. Her work was there, embedded in the financial section, her language, her framing, but credited to Julian, whose name appeared under the data insight slide. Margot didn't blink as she discussed it, as if daring Tiana to challenge the fiction. Tiana sat frozen, her hand gripping the edge of the table. She wanted to speak, to say something, but the air in the room had already turned heavy with unspoken rules. When the session ended, she stayed behind, waited for a pause, and asked Margot quietly about the attribution. Margot looked up with a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes and said the team had worked collaboratively and that titles were assigned based on future potential, not just effort. Then she picked up her phone and ended the conversation. That day, Tiana watched from a glass window as Margot led the team into the boardroom to deliver the pitch, flanked by Julian and Maria. Her work unfolded on the screen with precision and eloquence, and not a single person in that room knew the truth of who had built the foundation beneath it. She stood for the entire 90 minutes, listening to muffled applause, then returned to her desk and resumed filing quarterly audit drafts, as if she hadn't just been erased in real time. But the week was not done. Friday brought with it a corporate charity gala held in one of the city's most opulent rooftop venues. The invitation email had arrived for the interns the week before, listing dress code, arrival instructions, and duties. Maria and Julian had been asked to mingle with guests and assist the executive liaisons. Tiana had been told to arrive early and check in with the on-site staff. She arrived in a navy sheath dress and black pumps, hair pinned neatly, makeup applied with care she hadn't used in weeks. She was greeted not by a staff member, but by one of Margot's assistants, who handed her a clipboard and a list of names. Tiana blinked, confused. She was instructed to assist with coat check and escort guests to the ballroom. She asked if there had been a mistake. The assistant simply gestured toward the hallway. Inside, the event glittered with soft lighting, crystal glasses, and live string music. Margot stood at the center, flanked by partners and donors, her laughter effortless, her posture regal. Tiana walked each guest through the coat room and down the corridor, the hem of her dress brushing polished marble. No one asked her name. A few handed her tips. She didn't correct them. Near the end of the night, Margot walked by with a drink in hand and paused just long enough to notice the faint scuff on Tiana's right shoe, the one she had worn down walking 12 blocks after her train had been delayed. Margot leaned in slightly, her voice low, and mentioned that next time, the interns should be reminded to apply for the formal wear stipend if needed. Then she continued on, smiling at a senior partner's spouse. Tiana stood frozen, her chest tight, her hands clenched behind the clipboard. She felt the blood rush to her face, not from embarrassment, but from helplessness. There was no audience to see her humiliation, no bystander to offer comfort, only polished floors, tall mirrors, and the knowledge that this, too, would pass unnoticed. She approached the reception desk and requested temporary clearance. The security manager on duty took her ID, checked her name, and after several minutes, returned with a visitor sticker and an apology about a system-wide reset that had affected some badges. He didn't look her in the eyes as he said it. By the time she reached her floor, the day's tone had already been set. Her desk was still there, her computer still logged in, but a new intern orientation packet sat in her chair. Confused, she asked the coordinator about it, who quickly removed it with a muttered explanation that it was meant for the new facilities assistant. Tiana sat down and opened her inbox, where the first message she saw was from Margot. It read, "Please report to conference room 6B at 10:15 for your participation in today's inclusion training module." Tiana checked the firm calendar. There was no such session listed. At 10:15, she walked into 6B, where a circle of chairs had been arranged like a therapy workshop. She recognized a few junior employees, a few managers, and most of the intern group. Margot stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her tone warm and performative. Today's session, she explained, would be a role play focused on unconscious bias. Everyone would be given a scenario and a character. Tiana was handed a laminated card. Her role, a sidewalk vendor being questioned by corporate security. Across from her, Julian received the role of corporate executive. Tiana looked up, waiting for someone to notice the assignment's cruelty. No one did. The exercise began. Julian stood, recited his script with stiff professionalism, and questioned her character's presence, implying she didn't belong on the property. Tiana answered softly at first, then with more clarity, following the prompts. Margot watched with interest, nodding at every interaction. At the end, the group was asked to provide feedback. One woman commented that Tiana's responses were a little defensive and that perhaps she should have stayed calmer under pressure. Margot agreed, reminding everyone that perception mattered more than intent in professional spaces. No one mentioned the obvious, why Tiana had been assigned that role in the first place. After the session, Margot clapped lightly and handed each participant a certificate of engagement. Tiana's had her name spelled wrong. She returned to her desk in silence. That afternoon, she overheard Daniel and Maria laughing in the break room about the exercise, joking about how Julian nailed his role, while Tiana looked like she might actually cry. The door was slightly ajar. They didn't know she was there. She walked away before they saw her pulse steady, her chest hollow. 2 days later, the firm scheduled an all-staff luncheon to celebrate the success of a client pitch, the one built on her research and framed with Julian's name. The event was catered, hosted in the marble-floored gallery on the mezzanine, complete with a jazz trio and engraved glasses. Interns were included, but Tiana received a separate message instructing her to assist with guest coordination and table setup. She arrived before the others, her hands wrapped around linen napkins and silverware, arranging table placements for partners who didn't know she existed. As the room filled, Margot called for the interns to come forward for recognition. One by one, Daniel, Maria, and Julian stood beside Margot as she praised their contributions. Tiana stood in the back, just behind the bar, her name never spoken. A partner glanced her way and nodded vaguely. She nodded back, unsure if he recognized her or simply mistook her for support staff. That night, she received a calendar invite for a follow-up performance review. The subject line was blank. The location, Margot's office. She arrived at the scheduled time to find Margot sitting behind her desk, a performance log open beside her. Without greeting, Margot gestured for her to sit and began reading. Her tone was factual, emotionless. She cited Tiana's missed initiative, her limited impact, her lack of visibility on major projects. When Tiana tried to interject, to reference the data compilation, the hours spent on financial sheets, Margot raised a hand and continued. She noted that some managers had found Tiana difficult to read and hard to engage. When Tiana asked for clarification, Margot flipped a page and read a quote. She often appears distant, reluctant to participate, and avoids taking ownership of shared goals. Tiana sat perfectly still. Her mouth didn't move. Her throat didn't tighten. She listened. Margot concluded the session by recommending that Tiana focus more on being an approachable team player and seek opportunities to step into visible leadership. She closed the folder and dismissed her. Tiana stood, nodded once, and left the room without a sound. She returned to her desk and opened a blank email draft. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then curled into her lap. There was nothing to write. That evening, she stayed behind long after the others had left. The office lights dimmed on automatic timers, casting the floor into a soft gray hush. Tiana walked the hallway, looking into empty rooms, into glass walls that had never reflected her face. She paused in front of the executive suite, where a gold plaque bore Margot's name in bold serif font. For a long moment, she stared at it, unmoving, then turned and walked away. She didn't cry. She hadn't in weeks. Not since the silence had become so constant it no longer registered as pain. Yet she continued to show up, continued to hold together the unraveling strands of dignity, continued to hope that even in the quiet cruelty there might be some end, some threshold beyond which things could not fall further. She was wrong. That week, the firm was preparing for the highly anticipated Global Client Mixer, an event that drew international investors, potential partners, and major stakeholders. The preparation was extensive, and Margot was in charge of logistics, image, and coordination. All interns had been assigned duties based on their department alignment. Daniel was working with public relations. Maria was assisting the finance team. Julian had been asked to help the legal department compile compliance briefs for the attending clients. Tiana received her assignment through a printed note delivered by Margot's assistant, not even a direct email. The message read, "Please report to facilities at 4th floor supply and retrieve the guest itinerary folders. Assist on-site staff with distribution at mixer entrance." No mention of networking. No role in event content. Her job was to hand out folders. Again, she dressed the morning of the event in a fitted blazer and pressed slacks, hair smoothed back into a neat bun, heels low and practical. She arrived an hour early as instructed and met with the facilities lead, who handed her 2 full crates of guest packets, color-coded by attendee category. She sorted them with care, double-checking names, ensuring all materials were pristine. At the event space, which occupied the entire top floor of Greymoor's sister tower, she was stationed by the elevator with a rolling cart. Each time the doors opened, she stood straight, smiled gently, and handed out folders to men and women in tailored suits and polished shoes. Some thanked her, most didn't. Some glanced at her badge, others didn't look at her at all. The air around her smelled like expensive perfume and catered citrus, and the laughter drifting from the ballroom had a rhythm that reminded her she didn't belong. After the first hour, Margot passed by with 2 senior directors in conversation. She barely slowed as she spoke to Tiana in passing, instructing her to remain by the elevator a bit longer due to a late arrival. Then, with practiced grace, she turned back to her companions and continued walking, her heels clapping against the floor like punctuation marks to a sentence that excluded Tiana entirely. At one point, Maria came to drop off a batch of name tags. She looked at Tiana and hesitated as if debating whether to acknowledge her. In the end, she gave a tight smile and walked away. Tiana stayed in her position, eyes forward, smile faint, chest tight. She watched as the others were ushered into conversations with executives, as photographers captured interns mingling with upper management. She stayed outside the room where introductions happened, where impressions were made. She was never invited in. As the evening progressed, Tiana was finally told she could step inside and observe. She entered quietly, taking a spot near the refreshment table. Margot spotted her instantly and motioned her over. Tiana approached, thinking perhaps there was something for her to assist with. Instead, Margot pointed to a tray of empty glasses and instructed her to help the service staff by returning them to the prep area. The words were delivered with a smile, but they cut like glass. There was no pretense anymore. Margot had decided her place, and it was clear that place was not among peers. Tiana obeyed. She carried trays of used glasses down a hallway to the kitchen staging area, her dress slightly wrinkling at the waist from the weight of the trays, her hands trembling slightly from the fatigue of forced composure. One of the kitchen staff asked if she had been reassigned from catering. She didn't correct them. She didn't speak at all. As she returned to the ballroom, she passed by a hallway mirror and caught her own reflection. Shoulders slightly slumped, lipstick faded, the reflection of someone who looked like she was trying to disappear. The final humiliation came as the event closed and guests began filtering out. A group photo was being arranged, partners, executives, interns, and visiting directors. Margot stood at the center, motioning people into place. When she saw Tiana, she gestured dismissively and told her to wait by the side for post-cleanup coordination. Tiana stood off to the left as the photographer counted down. She watched the flash go off, saw smiles freeze into permanence, and knew her image would never be among them. She wasn't part of the firm's story. She was the one who folded chairs behind the narrative. After the photo, she was handed a clipboard and told to confirm that catering had accounted for all returned glassware. She spent the next 20 minutes going through counts and verifying disposal bins. No one thanked her. No one even noticed her leave. The train ride home was quiet. She sat in a nearly empty car, clutching her coat close to her chest, shoes damp from spilled ice near the service elevator. She stared out the window, not at her reflection, but at the city beyond, the lights pulsing like heartbeats in the distance. In that moment, she felt the weight of every ignored word, every stolen credit, every subtle dismissal. She applied it to her lapel, walked to the elevator, and rode up to the 28th floor with a practiced stillness, watching the lighted numbers pass by without any emotion. Her desk was just as she left it, neat, untouched, irrelevant. Her inbox was empty. Her calendar held no meetings. On the outside, it appeared as though she didn't exist. But inside her bag, carefully wrapped in a soft leather pouch, was a folded document she hadn't yet shared. Inside her mind, something far less quiet was beginning to move. The night before, after listing every instance of marginalization, theft, and humiliation in her notebook, she had sat at her kitchen table and stared at a single envelope for nearly an hour. It had been mailed to her months ago, before the internship began, from a name she no longer used, sealed in gray parchment with a deep blue stamp. She had nearly thrown it away out of defiance, a desire to be judged on merit alone, to earn her path without the shadow of inheritance. But last night, she opened it. Inside was a formal document, notarized and signed, confirming the legal ownership of a dormant investment trust belonging to her maternal grandfather, a man who had once co-owned Graymore Stratton's foundational capital fund before his shares were quietly dissolved after his passing. What most of the firm didn't know, because she had deliberately never told them, was that her grandfather, Abram Miles, had been one of the original 3 partners who seeded the capital that allowed Graymore's predecessor firm to secure its first private equity acquisition. Over the years, as mergers and name changes consumed the institution, Abram's name disappeared, but his legacy had not. The trust was now active, revived through the work of her late mother, who had spent the final years of her life reclaiming her father's legacy and consolidating the rights passed down. Tiana, at 26, was now the legal steward of those holdings, silent but binding. She hadn't used it before. She hadn't needed to. But now, as she sat at her desk and watched Julian laugh with Margot by the conference glass, as Maria nodded along to an executive's casual joke, as her name remained unspoken, her face unacknowledged, and her effort erased, she began to reconsider the cost of silence. Midday arrived with no meetings, no assignments, and no emails. She stood and walked to the HR floor, requesting a copy of her performance record. The associate hesitated, asked for authorization, then offered a printed file with the usual tight-lipped courtesy. Tiana took it, walked to the unused intern conference room, and began to read. The report contained every distortion Margot had whispered into the corporate machinery. Comments about her being withdrawn, unengaged, not a team player. There were quotes attributed to directors Tiana had never worked under. There were suggestions she might not be the right fit for Graymore's dynamic environment. There was no mention of her data work, no mention of her reports, nothing that reflected the hours she'd invested while her peers sipped espresso in creative huddles. She closed the folder and exhaled slowly. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the trust document. She unfolded it, spread it neatly across the table, and placed it beside the performance review. For a long moment, she sat in silence, her eyes scanning the words her mother had fought to protect, the signature of a man long buried by history, the number at the bottom that represented quiet power no one at Graymore suspected she held. That afternoon, she made a call. It wasn't to HR or Margot or the intern coordinator. It was to her mother's former advisor, a man named Warren Elridge, who still managed the legal aspects of the Miles estate. She hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. He answered immediately, as though he'd been waiting. After a brief pause, she asked him to prepare the ownership summary for disclosure. Not for litigation, not yet, but for acknowledgement. When she ended the call, she sat for a long time at the window, her reflection half merged with the skyline, neither fully inside nor out. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel angry. She felt something quieter but stronger than either: resolve. At 4:30, Margot sent an email to all interns with a mandatory RSVP for a leadership panel the following morning. Tiana replied promptly. The next morning, she arrived early, dressed in a charcoal suit that had belonged to her mother, the one she had saved for a day she wasn't sure would come. She walked into the boardroom with her folder tucked beneath her arm and took her seat quietly at the back. As the room filled, Margot entered, smiling as always, and began greeting the partners. When she noticed Tiana, her eyes narrowed slightly, just for a second, but she said nothing. The panel began with introductions, a roundtable of executives sharing career wisdom with the interns. Julian spoke. Maria spoke. Daniel cracked a well-rehearsed joke. When it was Tiana's turn, she stood slowly, adjusted her sleeve, and calmly stepped forward. She did not read from her notes. She did not raise her voice. She simply introduced herself as Tiana Ellison Miles and began to speak about legacy, about ownership, about the difference between earning your place and being denied it because others refuse to see you. She didn't seek meetings, didn't broadcast her status, didn't return the stares that followed her from corridor to corridor. Instead, she moved with the same steady composure that had carried her through every act of exclusion, now transformed from survival into presence. That morning, Margot Langford's usual ease had faltered. She'd left the panel room immediately after Tiana's remarks, her expression strained behind forced pleasantries. When she returned to her office, she found an email from Legal Affairs asking to confirm internal records regarding historical partnerships tied to legacy trusts. A second message from the Office of Ethics and Compliance requested a statement regarding her management of intern assignments, specifically pertaining to claims of misrepresentation and task allocation. She sat in her chair longer than usual, reading both messages twice before minimizing her screen. She didn't respond. Tiana, meanwhile, returned to her desk, retrieved the original file of performance reviews and departmental assignments she had compiled over the past week, and walked calmly to the Director of Personnel Development's office. Without preamble, she handed over the folder, nodded once, and left. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The pages inside spoke clearly, documented disparities in assignments, timeline discrepancies in email requests, visual evidence of data attribution being reassigned without credit. The folder included a copy of the gala program and a printout of the team photo from which she had been excluded. She had labeled nothing. The implications were self-evident. That afternoon, Margot called an unscheduled meeting with her department heads. The conference room was sealed, blinds drawn. Tiana wasn't invited, but she didn't need to attend. She already knew what would be discussed: the risk exposure to the firm if the Miles Trust status reached outside ears, the potential fallout if claims of targeted discrimination within the prestigious internship program went public, the reputational damage if the story was ever framed in terms of legacy, race, and suppression. Word had already spread beyond the walls of Graymore. Warren Elridge, her family's legal steward, had quietly notified the Trustees Association, and they had begun informal inquiries into dormant legacies in corporate foundations across the city. Emails were being forwarded. Names were being noticed. That night, Tiana didn't go home. She stayed after hours, alone on the 28th floor, sitting at her desk beneath the dim glow of overhead lights. She wasn't working. She was thinking. The pressure in her chest had shifted. What once had been a weight of helplessness now felt like something else, a tension preparing to snap, not in chaos, but in clarity. At 8:30, the elevators dinged. She turned her head and saw Margot step onto the floor alone, her heels echoing louder than usual in the quiet. She approached slowly, not with the arrogant stride of control, but the tentative steps of someone unaccustomed to uncertainty. Tiana didn't rise. She didn't speak. Margot stood in front of her desk and folded her hands, the posture formal but brittle. After a pause, she offered a quiet comment about the day's intensity. She mentioned misunderstanding, the pace of management, how things might have been handled differently in hindsight. Her tone carried the cadence of someone attempting grace, but her eyes betrayed calculation. Tiana didn't interrupt. She let her finish. Then, without raising her voice or shifting her posture, she responded by asking one simple question. "Did you ever think I wouldn't find out?" The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And in that silence, Margot understood what she had lost. It wasn't just about the trust or the position. It was about perception. Tiana's composure was no longer a weakness to be manipulated. It was a strength Margot couldn't match. The next day brought the unmasking. The firm's internal oversight committee released a memo to executive leadership confirming the legitimacy of Tiana's claim to the Miles Trust. A quiet note was included. Her lineage and legal holdings had not been previously disclosed in corporate legacy records due to archival inconsistencies. Another document followed, requesting an immediate review of the internship structure under Margot's purview. Tiana was asked, publicly this time, to participate in a roundtable for equity and access. She declined. Instead, she submitted a letter formally concluding her internship, citing misalignment of values. She attached a report, concise, professional, irrefutable, summarizing the treatment she had received, cross-referenced with documentation. No anger, no emotion, just facts. And at the bottom, she signed it with the full weight of her name, Tiana Ellison Miles. That same afternoon, emails began circulating about a restructure in Margot's department. A few lines in the HR digest announced a transition in leadership roles. Margot was not mentioned by name, but everyone understood. Within days, whispers turned into conclusions. Partners who once ignored Tiana now discussed her cautiously. Some tried to reach out. She responded to none. She packed her things without ceremony. She left no farewell note. When the elevator doors closed behind her that final day, she stood tall, hands at her side. No smile, no bitterness, just peace. Outside, the wind had shifted. One of the founding partners, now semi-retired but still influential in investment decisions, called for an emergency review of all intern performance logs from the past 5 years. What he found wasn't just negligence, it was a pattern. There were inconsistencies, unexplained attrition in minority candidates, multiple redacted exit summaries, and most damning of all, ghosted feedback from interns who had raised complaints that were never formally recorded. Several of the flagged reviews bore Margot Langford's signature or direct oversight. When confronted, she denied manipulation, citing miscommunication and procedural volume. But the data spoke louder. What began as a personnel question became a reputational crisis. A partner on the board suggested placing Margot on temporary administrative leave while further inquiry was conducted. She protested, of course, framing the suggestion as premature and disrespectful. But the optics had shifted. For the first time in over a decade, Margot found herself questioned, her authority suspended in a limbo, where her voice no longer carried automatic weight. The assistant she once dismissed without a glance now sat in the review panels, compiling timeline evidence. People she had treated as invisible were no longer willing to cover for her. In her corner office, stripped of the ease she once wielded, Margot began to unravel. She reread Tiana's resignation letter and audit file 3 times in one afternoon, trying to find a flaw, a crack in the calm composure. There was none. Everything had been presented factually, without embellishment, which made it irrefutable. She tried reaching out to allies, but responses came slowly or not at all. Meetings were canceled without explanation. The HR director she had once mentored suddenly became unavailable. Her calendar, once filled with executive strategy calls and brand consulting pitches, now showed wide, vacant hours. The silence was worse than criticism. It was erasure. The irony tasted bitter. She found herself seated at her desk longer than usual, staring at walls that once felt empowering, now closing in like a box. She reviewed her own past communications and assignments, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. But each sentence she read felt different now, heavy with the implication of bias she had never intended to recognize. When an anonymous staff feedback report listed her name under managerial figures who contributed to a culture of exclusion, it stung, not because she disagreed, but because she finally suspected they might be right. Meanwhile, Tiana's name was spoken more than ever, though never in gossip. Interns began citing her report in safe space meetings organized by junior associates. A few quietly mentioned their own experiences, how they had been passed over, ignored, dismissed for reasons that had no documentation. The conversation spread. The culture began to shift, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Graymore Stratton, a firm once known for prestige shrouded in polished distance, was now being observed under a different lens. Legal was tasked with developing new transparency protocols for mentorship evaluations. The internship committee was dissolved and rebuilt under external supervision. Anonymous review channels were implemented. Equity seminars now had real teeth. During a closed-door board session, a recommendation was made that Margot formally step down. The motion wasn't forced. It wasn't loud, but it was unanimous. She was offered the option to resign gracefully. She took 2 days to consider. On the second morning, she walked into the building through the side entrance, not the main lobby. Her once prized heels now scuffed, her blouse slightly unbuttoned at the collar, her hair not yet styled. The receptionist greeted her with neutrality, not disdain, but not the familiarity she was used to. She rode the elevator in silence, gripping a folder she had prepared containing statements, project summaries, and a letter outlining her contributions. None of it would change the outcome. She knew that now. By noon, Margot Langford submitted her formal resignation. The firm accepted it without delay. The message sent to the wider staff was short and diplomatic, citing her decision to pursue other ventures. But everyone knew what it meant. She left the office that afternoon with no speech, no farewell party, no photo op, just a simple exit. She passed by the same intern wing she once ruled without turning her head. The security guard didn't speak as she stepped outside. The air was cold, biting with winter's approach, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She walked to the train instead of calling for a car, her thoughts a blur of pride and regret. She wasn't angry. She wasn't blameless. She was just undone. Across the city, in a quiet cafe far from skyscrapers and boardrooms, Tiana sat by the window with a folder of her own. It contained a printed article from an emerging business ethics publication detailing her story, referring to her not by family ties, but by the actions she had taken. She didn't smile, didn't bask in attention. She simply closed the folder and sipped her coffee. She had no interest in revenge, no appetite for spectacle. She was already planning her next step, one that didn't require permission, one built on her own foundation, not someone else's approval. She received a message from Warren that afternoon confirming the finalization of the Miles Trust public reinstatement. A clause had been activated by her disclosure, giving her oversight on community development grants originally seeded by her grandfather. It was more than money. It was agency. She walked home in the late afternoon light, wind cool against her face, her pace unhurried. 3 months had passed since Margot Langford exited Graymore Stratton, and the dust of her departure settled into the architecture of the firm, like a memory too sharp to ignore, but too recent to forget. Her name was no longer spoken in meetings, not out of disrespect, but because her shadow still lingered in unspoken ways. There were no framed photos on office walls or plaques in the hallway to mark her influence, just gaps where her initiatives used to exist, replaced by new guidelines, external oversight, and training modules that emphasized listening over hierarchy and substance over polish. The firm hadn't collapsed, but it had changed not in a loud rebranding effort, but in quiet, persistent ripples that redefined how people moved through its halls. Interns were now paired with cross-departmental mentors, evaluations required co-signatures, and contributions were tracked in shared platforms where no single manager could erase a name or rewrite a narrative. For many, the new structure felt bureaucratic at first, but as time passed, its intention revealed itself. It was accountability, not punishment, but a mirror for everyone to look into. Margot, meanwhile, had withdrawn from the spotlight she once owned. 4 weeks after leaving, she disappeared from industry conversations, not because people had forgotten her, but because no one knew what to say. She had declined all interviews, turned down a quiet offer to pivot into private consulting, and avoided every event where the phrase leadership excellence was tossed around with champagne flutes. She rented a small cottage outside the city near the coast, far from glass towers and boardrooms, and lived in silence. Her mornings were spent walking along the shoreline, waves crashing quietly against the rocks, the wind stiff and honest. She began journaling not for redemption, but for clarity, scribbling questions she couldn't answer and statements she once believed without challenge. At first, the entries were defensive, filled with rationalizations, reminders of her own hard work, her broken ceilings, the pressure to perform. the absence of malice in her actions. But as the pages turned, so did the voice. It softened, not in weakness, but in awareness. She began to write about moments she had chosen not to look deeper, about names she had forgotten too easily, about how quickly comfort had turned into blindness. One morning, while reading a small business ethics blog, she came across an op-ed written anonymously by a young woman referred to only as a former intern who chose to speak with her work rather than with her voice. It recounted her experience with systemic dismissal, subtle manipulation, and the silent erasure of potential. The piece didn't mention Margot's name, but it didn't need to. Margot closed her laptop, placed it gently on the table, and sat in stillness. The words hadn't accused her. They had illuminated her. For the first time, she wept, not out of shame, but because she finally understood the difference between being misunderstood and being unaccountable. That day, she called Warren Elridge. The call was brief. She asked if he could arrange a meeting, not with Tiana, not yet, but with a community program funded by the Miles Trust. She didn't want to speak. She wanted to volunteer. Warren hesitated, then agreed. 2 weeks later, Margot began working at a local mentorship program for first-generation college students, assisting with Resume workshops, public speaking sessions, and navigating corporate structures. She didn't speak about her past. She didn't share her title. She introduced herself simply as someone who wanted to help young professionals navigate the system without losing their voice. And she listened. She sat across from students who reminded her of versions of people she had once overlooked, and for every hour she spent in their company, she found another question to ask herself. Not for absolution, but for learning. Back in the city, Tiana had moved forward. She wasn't seeking the spotlight, but it found her anyway. Her story became required reading in several graduate leadership programs. She was invited to contribute to ethical framework policies at 2 other firms. She accepted one and declined the other, choosing impact over prestige. She began working quietly with nonprofit foundations, focusing on equitable access to corporate mentorship pipelines, bringing both data and lived experience to the table. Her name was no longer whispered. It was spoken with respect. She carried herself as she always had, calm, observant, composed. But now the world looked back. One spring afternoon, she received a letter. Not an email, not a formal request, just a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page. No apology, no defense. Just a message: I saw you. I see you now. Thank you for not vanishing. Tiana read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in her drawer. She didn't need confirmation. She didn't seek closure. The letter wasn't a resolution. It was a recognition. And sometimes that was enough. Years later, when asked about her experience during a panel discussion on ethics and equity, she didn't speak about revenge or victory. She spoke about silence, the kind that erases and the kind that reveals. She spoke about systems, not villains, and about how leadership isn't what you say when people are watching, but what you choose when no one is listening. She closed with a simple truth, that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, reshapes, waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't destroy, it teaches. The audience didn't erupt. They sat still, the kind of stillness that comes from understanding. And in that moment, the message landed, not as a warning, but as a hope, that what had happened wasn't just a reckoning. It was a lesson. And those who had once chosen not to see, now carried the burden of sight. The end. If you've been drawn into Tiana's journey and the powerful message behind it, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay connected for more gripping narratives that challenge, inspire, and reveal hidden truths. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the twists and turns of the plot? Which part hit hardest for you? And where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your voice matters here.